When an arrogant billionaire woman, believing her wealth grants her absolute power, is forced to face an uncompromising judge, renowned for his unwavering sense of justice, the entire world holds its breath. But no one expects that his ruling will not only shatter her arrogance, but also change her life in a way no one could have ever imagined. Where are you watching from? Share in the comments, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. For more inspiring stories, Los Angeles is the city of dreams and power players. At the heart of this world of finance and luxury, Victoria Lancaster is a name everyone knows as the powerful billionaire, CEO of Lancaster Enterprises. She controls a massive empire spanning real estate, luxury hotel chains, and billion-dollar investment funds. People call her the queen of real estate. But to those who have worked with her, Victoria is more like an ice queen. Stunning, powerful, yet utterly cold and ruthless. Victoria was not an heiress. She built her career from nothing, but no one can deny that her arrogance has long surpassed even her own success. To Victoria, money is not just power. It's the law in the boardroom. She does not need to raise her voice. A single glance is enough for partners and employees to understand that there is no room for sympathy or weakness. One former employee once said, "Working with Victoria is like walking a tightrope between skyscrapers. One small mistake, and you're gone with no way back once." When a branch director proposed a slight reduction in profits to provide better support for employees, Victoria simply smirked and asked coldly, "Do I pay you to make money or to do charity?" Within 24 hours he was replaced. No one dared to challenge Victoria Lancaster. She was the law, the power, the one who set the rules. Victoria cared nothing for morality or empathy, because she believed the world belonged only to the strong. To her, money could buy anything from respect to justice. She had never bowed to anyone, simply because no one was worthy enough to make her. The media loved her, but also feared her. Every time she appeared on the cover of Forbes or Business Insider, she was the embodiment of the modern power woman. But any journalist who dared to dig into the dark side of Lancaster Enterprises soon received a friendly call, suggesting they change their topic. Her business rivals respected her, but many despised her. A financial mogul once defeated by Victoria bitterly remarked, "She never loses control. Not for a single second. She can smile at you one moment and tear you apart the next, without batting an eye." Her employees feared her once. A young assistant accidentally spilled coffee on her channel coat. In a room as silent as a graveyard, Victoria simply stood up, adjusted her dress, and looked straight at the assistant. "I do not hire clumsy people. You have 10 minutes to leave the company." When Victoria Lancaster walked into a room, she did not have to try to be the center of attention. She simply was. She owned 3 yachts, one of which had a private helipad. Every week, she flew to a different country in her private jet, staying in the most luxurious hotels, where a single night stay could feed an average family for an entire year. Her parties were exclusively for the ultra-wealthy, where a single glass of wine could cost tens of thousands of dollars. But no matter where she was, Victoria never lost control. She was not the reckless or flamboyant type of billionaire. Her danger lay in her absolute coldness. She knew her power and wielded it in the most ruthless way possible. People could admire or despise Victoria Lancaster, but no one could ignore her. She was the kind of person whose magazine covers made you stop and read, the kind of person whose presence in a room made you feel her dominance immediately. But Victoria had one fatal flaw. She believed she was untouchable. She believed that the law was just another obstacle that money could overcome, that she stood above everything, even justice, and that was the greatest misconception of her life, a misconception that she was about to pay for at a very high price. Victoria Lancaster always believed that every road she traveled had to yield to her, that she was never accountable to anyone. But on that fateful night, that belief pushed her to a boundary she never anticipated. Los Angeles. 11:47 p.m. The city was still awake. Neon lights flickering and reflecting off the sleek, black body of Victoria's Lamborghini Huracan. She had just left a lavish party at the 5-star Lancaster Grand Hotel where fake laughter blended with the clinking of champagne glasses and conversations full of vanity. In the driver's seat, Victoria tilted her head slightly, her deep red lips curling into an arrogant smile. The car sped down Wilshire Boulevard, its engine roaring, a challenge hurled at the world. She was not drunk on alcohol. She was drunk on the feeling of holding the city's fate in her hands. The traffic light turned red. Victoria did not bother lifting her foot off the gas. To her, ordinary rules did not apply. Others might hesitate, stop, and wait. But Victoria Lancaster never waited for anything. She pressed harder on the accelerator. At the corner of the street, Walter Jenkins, a 72-year-old man with silver, white hair and a slow, deliberate gait, was crossing the road. He had no idea that in just a few seconds, one of the most powerful women in America would come dangerously close to taking his life. Suddenly the roar of an engine tore through the night. He turned his head. 2 glaring headlights bore down on him like the eyes of a wild beast. Walter's heart pounded, panic surged through him. He quickened his steps, but it was too late. The Lamborghini tore past, missing him by mere inches. Terror flooded his body in a desperate moment. Walter stumbled, lost his balance, and crashed onto the sidewalk. His arm slammed against the concrete. A sickening crack echoed in the night. Victoria slowed down, not out of concern, but out of annoyance. She glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the old man curled up on the sidewalk. A passerby rushed over to help him. For a split second their eyes met. Walter, in pain, stared directly at Victoria. There was no anger in his gaze, only a deep disappointment, like he had just seen the true face of someone he once admired on the cover of a business magazine. Victoria did not turn back. She did not step out to check on him. She simply scoffed and muttered under her breath, "He should not have walked so slowly." Then she stepped on the gas, leaving the old man behind in the cold streets. But this time Victoria could not control the narrative. Within an hour, surveillance footage from a nearby security camera leaked online. A Lamborghini blasting through a red light at reckless speed. Walter Jenkins collapsing onto the pavement, his arm twisted in agony. Victoria slowing down, glancing for a second, then indifferently driving away. The internet erupted. The media swarmed the story. Major outlets like the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and Kin ran headlines filled with outrage. Billionaire Victoria Lancaster, arrogance stained in blood, running a red light, nearly killing a man. Does Victoria Lancaster think she's above the law? The public was furious. Social media exploded with condemnation. Who does she think she is, trampling over people's lives like that? If it were an ordinary person, they'd be arrested, but Victoria Lancaster. Can money buy justice? Walter Jenkins is a retired teacher. He dedicated his life to educating people, and this is how society repays him. Small protests began forming outside Lancaster Enterprises, The company's stock took a hit. Luxury brands that once partnered with Victoria scrambled to erase her image from their campaigns. For the first time in her life, Victoria felt the weight of public scrutiny, and it was not something money could buy her way out of. 48 hours after the incident, the Los Angeles City Court officially summoned Victoria Lancaster. The case would be overseen by Judge Jonathan Mitchell, a man known for his strictness and unwavering sense of justice. But when her assistant delivered the news, Victoria simply smirked, leaned back in her chair, and took a sip of wine. "It's just a stupid lawsuit. I have the best lawyers in the country. Let's see what they can do to me." Her words dripped with arrogance, laced with defiance. But what Victoria did not realize was that this time, she had picked the wrong opponent. This time she would not be able to buy her way out. This time justice would not let her escape. Victoria Lancaster had never feared a courtroom. In her mind, justice was nothing more than a concept that could be bought with money. She had seen other CEOs get into trouble, only to use their power and influence to slip out unscathed. So to her, this trial was nothing more than a performance, a play in which she was, of course, the main character, the one who decided how it would end. Los Angeles 9 Men. The city courthouse was packed with reporters, spectators, and social activists, closely following the high-profile lawsuit. The atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy, and everyone present understood that this was not just an ordinary trial. It was a battle between power and justice. The large wooden doors swung open. Victoria Lancaster entered, the very image of a nice queen, her golden hair pulled back into a flawless updo, a tailored Giorgio Armani suit hugging her figure, and the sharp clicks of her Louboutin heels striking the wooden floor like cold, deliberate punctuation. All eyes turned to her, but Victoria did not spare anyone a glance, as if no one in the room was worth her attention. She took her seat at the defendant's table, crossing her legs, her fingers idly gliding over the 8-carat diamond ring on her hand, as though she were in a business meeting, rather than facing justice. In the front row, Walter Jenkins, the victim, watched her with disappointment, though without resentment. He had hoped for a shred of remorse from this woman, but all he saw was an impenetrable wall of arrogance. All rise. The entire courtroom stood in unison as Judge Jonathan Mitchell entered, a dignified black man with neatly trimmed salt and pepper hair and piercing eyes behind thin framed glasses. He was known for his zero tolerance toward those who abused power. And today, seated before him, was the most powerful billionaire woman in America. But Victoria Lancaster remained seated. She did not stand. A murmur of outrage rippled through the courtroom. The sheer audacity of her defiance was beyond belief. Judge Mitchell's sharp gaze immediately locked onto her. Without saying a word, the entire room was plunged into a suffocating tension. Still no reaction from Victoria. She simply took a slow breath, leaned back in her chair, laced her fingers together, and met the judge's stare with an icy challenge. Judge Mitchell did not get angry. He merely raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable, as if to say, "I've seen too many like you before. But you have no idea who you're dealing with." Finally, in a firm yet composed voice, he spoke. "Defendant Victoria Lancaster, in this courtroom everyone is equal before the law. I will say this only once. Stand up immediately." The air was thick with tension. No one dared to breathe. Victoria blinked, the corner of her lips curving into a slight smirk, before she finally stood, not out of respect for the court, but because she had decided the game was about to begin. Judge Mitchell opened the case file before him, his voice resonating with authority. Defendant Victoria Lancaster, you are charged with running a red light, reckless driving, nearly causing a serious accident, and leaving the scene without assisting the victim. Do you deny these charges? Victoria let out a soft chuckle, her gaze sharp and provocative. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she ran a finger along the wooden table, moving as if she were negotiating a business deal. Before finally speaking, I do not see this as a serious matter. It's not like I hit him. This is all being blown out of proportion. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. A wave of anger flickered in the eyes around her. Walter Jenkins stared at her again. But this time, his disappointment had deepened into something else. Something far more sorrowful. Judge Mitchell nodded, his expression unwavering. So, in your opinion, nearly causing an accident, sending an elderly man to the hospital, and leaving the scene without checking on him, is not serious? Victoria shrugged, her tone still indifferent. Like I said, I do not think it's as big of a deal as people are making it out to be. Everyone speeds sometimes. I was just going a little faster than usual. The room was utterly silent. Judge Mitchell sighed, placing his pen down, his gaze thoughtful, as if he were seeing right through the woman before him. Do you believe that because you have money, you can escape responsibility? Victoria scoffed, her eyes gleaming with defiance. Your Honor, it's not about money. It's about the fact that this is not the massive issue people are making it out to be. Her words sent a final, electric charge of tension through the air. Judge Mitchell did not respond right away. He observed her for a few seconds, then turned another page in the case file. His eyes sharpened as they bore into her. In that case, let me show you what justice truly is. Victoria Lancaster had no idea that Judge Jonathan Mitchell's final words marked the beginning of a sentence she could not buy her way out of, one that would change her life forever. Judge Jonathan Mitchell maintained his composure, but his sharp gaze cut through Victoria Lancaster's arrogance. Like a blade, he slowly repeated the question, this time with more emphasis. Defendant Lancaster, do you understand the consequences of your actions? Victoria shrugged, a faint smirk curling her lips. Her icy blue eyes gleamed with defiance. I did not even touch him. What's all the fuss about? Her words dropped into the courtroom, like a frozen dagger, plunging the entire room into a tense silence. No one could believe what they had just heard. From the audience, a middle-aged woman gaped in shock, while a young man shook his head in disappointment. Several reporters covered their mouths, as if they had just witnessed something beyond comprehension. In the corner of the room, Walter Jenkins, the victim, sat motionless, his gaze filled with profound sorrow. Not anger, not hatred, just deep, crushing disappointment. As if at some point he had still hoped that Victoria, no matter how powerful she was, still had a conscience. But now, in front of him, stood a woman completely devoid of remorse. Judge Mitchell closed the case file, set his pen down, and folded his arms. He made no effort to hide his disappointment. As he looked at Victoria, you truly believe that, Defendant Lancaster? Victoria lifted her chin, her confidence unwavering. Your Honor, everyone speeds. Sometimes if I had actually hit him, I would take responsibility. But I did not, so why should I apologize? The room fell into another suffocating silence. Across from her, Victoria's lawyer held his breath, realizing that her words had just become a fatal mistake. From the audience, a middle-aged man, a war veteran, could no longer stay silent. He shot to his feet, his voice trembling with rage. "You really feel no guilt? You drove like a maniac and left without looking back. What if Mr. Jenkins had not dodged in time? What if that had been your father?" A murmur spread through the courtroom. Outrage simmered in every stare, in every heavy breath. But Victoria merely curled her lips into a smirk, her gaze unshaken. "He's not my father, and I have no obligation to care." Her words struck like a blade, straight into the hearts of everyone present. Judge Mitchell tapped the bench lightly, signaling for order in the courtroom. But even he could not mask the sheer disbelief and disappointment in his eyes. "So in your view, other people's lives do not matter? As long as you're not directly responsible?" Victoria sat up straight, her voice as cold and indifferent as if she were discussing an irrelevant number in a financial report. "I'm not here to debate morality, Your Honor, I'm simply stating the facts." Judge Mitchell locked eyes with Victoria, his tone now carrying a steely finality. "Do you think you can buy justice the same way you buy everything else in your life?" "Defendant Lancaster." Victoria scoffed, a glint of provocation in her gaze. "I do not need to buy justice. I just need the law to do its job." She leaned back in her chair, a mocking smile playing on her lips. "I have the best legal team in America. We all know how this will end." Her words were like a match, dropped into a barrel of gunpowder. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, filled with glares of pure resentment. Judge Mitchell slowly removed his glasses, setting them on the desk, before looking at Victoria with unshakable authority. He was not angry, he was not fuming, but his voice was cold, firm, and unwavering. "You think you can control everything with money, but there's one thing you will never buy: accountability." For the first time, Victoria's brow twitched, a flicker of unease creeping into her mind. Judge Mitchell tapped the case file once, then fixed her with a stare, as he declared the words that made the entire courtroom fall into stunned silence. "I will not let you walk away from this easily." Defendant Lancaster, justice is not a business transaction. And now you will face the real consequences. For the first time in the trial, Victoria's smug smile vanished. Not because she was afraid, but because for the first time, she realized this time, money might not be able to save her. Silence engulfed the courtroom, so heavy that even the rag breathing of the attendees could be heard. Judge Jonathan Mitchell quietly observed the woman before him, a billionaire accustomed to bending the law to her will, now sitting in the defendant's chair, maintaining an air of defiance to the very end. But he did not need her to plead guilty. He did not need her insincere lies. He only needed justice to be served. Placing his hand on the sentencing document, his voice rang out steady, powerful, unwavering. "Defendant Victoria Lancaster, this court hereby sentences you to 200 hours of community service at the Los Angeles Veteran Support Center." Victoria froze in a split second, her face once calm and haughty, twisted with fury. "What?" She shot up from her seat, fists clenched, eyes blazing with anger. "You want me to scrub floors, wash dishes in some shelter full of losers?" A wave of outraged murmurs rippled through the courtroom. They are men and women who dedicated their lives to protecting this country. A middle-aged man, clearly a veteran, sprang to his feet from the gallery, his eyes red with anger. But Victoria did not care. She whirled toward her lawyer, her voice hissing like a panther backed into a corner. "I will appeal. I am not a maid." Judge Mitchell remained unfazed by her outburst. He sat still, his gaze firm, as though he had anticipated this reaction all along. "You are free to appeal, Miss Lancaster." His voice was calm, yet it carried an unshakable weight, pressing down on the room with the force of justice itself. "But remember, this justice cannot be bought." The words landed like a thunderous blow. His statement was not just directed at Victoria. It was a declaration to the world. No matter who you are, no matter how much money you have, the law remains the same for all. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. No one dared to move, no one dared to speak. Every eye was on Victoria. She stood there, her hands trembling with rage, her face flushed red, her lips pressed into a thin line. All her life she had been the one in control. She made the rules, she decided the fates of others. Never, not once in her entire existence, had anyone forced her to do anything. But today, for the first time, she was in a position she could not control. Victoria turned sharply to her lawyer, her voice seething with anger. "Do something. He cannot rule like this." The aging lawyer simply bowed his head, saying nothing. He knew this was a battle Victoria could not win. Judge Mitchell raised his gavel. The sound of the strike echoed powerfully, cementing the fact that this was not a threat, but an irrevocable sentence. "This court is adjourned. Defendant Lancaster will begin her sentence immediately. The court will closely monitor her compliance." That final statement marked the end of Victoria's arrogance. As she stepped out of the courtroom, she felt her world crumbling. She could not believe she had ended up like this. She who had used money to erase every problem was now being forced into manual labor. Like a common failure, she was furious. She was resentful, but above all, there was nothing she could do to change it. Outside the courthouse, dozens of reporters were waiting, cameras flashing relentlessly. "Miss Lancaster, do you think this sentence is fair? Do you regret your actions? Will you continue to appeal?" Victoria ignored them all, striding quickly into the waiting limousine. But no matter how far she tried to run, the truth remained the same. She would serve at a veterans center. She would do the work she had always considered beneath her. And most importantly, she would no longer be the invincible Victoria Lancaster. What she did not know, this was not a punishment. This was the greatest lesson of her life. The luxurious limousine slowly came to a stop in front of the Los Angeles Veterans Support Center, a worn-down building with gray brick walls and a roof faded by time. No red carpet, no flashing cameras, no respect or flattery. Victoria Lancaster sat still in the car, her eyes fixed on the center's entrance, as if it were a prison. She hated this place at first sight. She hated the stale atmosphere, the faint smell of cheap food drifting from the kitchen. She hated the way the world forced her to bow down to people she had never once considered worthy of her attention. But most of all, she hated that she could not escape. The car door opened. Victoria stepped out, her gleaming Christian Louboutin heels clicking against the hard cement ground. All eyes turned to her, a group of veterans sitting in the courtyard, chatting amongst themselves, suddenly fell silent at the sight of a blonde woman, dressed in a designer suit, walking in as if this were a corporate board meeting. A man with graying hair, wearing a faded button-up shirt, let out a mocking whistle. "Well, well. Looks like we've got a visitor. Did not know this place had an elite finance department. Laughter followed a few eyes, filled with quiet disdain. Victoria did not bother responding. She was used to being watched. But this time, she was not standing on a pedestal of power. She was being judged like an inferior. The frosted glass door swung open, leading her to the reception desk. Behind the worn-out desk sat Linda Evans, the center's manager, a middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair, and a face hardened by a lifetime of struggles. She glanced Victoria up and down, her eyes showing neither admiration nor intimidation. No greetings, no formalities. Linda simply tossed an old apron across the counter, stained and faded from years of use. Today you'll be washing dishes. Victoria blinked, her fingers stiffening as they touched the rough fabric. You're joking, right? Linda did not raise an eyebrow, did not change her tone. I never joke about work. I do not do this. I'm not some low-class laborer. Linda planted both hands on the desk, arms crossed, tilting her head as she studied Victoria like a stubborn child. Who do you think you are, a queen? This is not your hotel. This is our center here. You do not get to give orders. If you do not want to wash dishes, the door's right there. But if you walk out without doing your job, I'll report it to the court immediately. And we'll see what Judge Mitchell has to say about that. Victoria clenched her teeth. She knew Linda was not bluffing. If she refused, she'd be considered non-compliant with her sentence. If she walked away, she'd face harsher consequences. Maybe even jail time if she gave in. She'd have to endure the one thing she despised most, doing the kind of work meant for people she had always looked down on. Her fists tightened, but then with a sharp motion, she grabbed the apron and put it on, as if it were a dagger, stabbing straight through her pride. Fine, I'll do it. But let me make one thing clear. I will not be here for long. Linda just shrugged and gestured toward the kitchen. We'll see about that. The kitchen at the center was nothing like any kitchen Victoria had ever stepped into before. No private chefs, no imported wines or premium ingredients. Just sinks overflowing with dirty dishes, the stale scent of old food, and veterans sitting at tables, waiting for their simple meals. Victoria froze in front of the towering pile of plates. Her hands trembled as she reached for one, still greasy from leftover food. What the hell am I doing here? A voice came from behind her. Careful, princess. That grease might ruin your manicure. Victoria turned around, locking eyes with a young man with messy brown hair and a prosthetic metal arm. You do not look like someone who's used to manual labor. But here everyone pulls their weight. No exceptions. Victoria clenched her fists. Swallowing the frustration rising in her chest, she lowered her head, grabbed a rag, and shoved her hands into the soapy water. It's just washing dishes. But as the cold water seeped into her skin, as the stench of old food filled her senses, she felt every ounce of her pride being crushed. This was only the first day, and she already hated it more than anything in the world. Cold soap suds slipped through Victoria Lancaster's delicate fingers, seeping into the neatly trimmed edges of her nails, stirring an inexplicable sense of disgust. Every time she dipped her hands into the grease-laden sink, it felt as if she was losing a piece of her dignity. But it was not just the work that unsettled her, it was the eyes. Scattered throughout the dining hall were people, veterans, their bodies and souls marked by battle scars. They did not say much, but their gazes carried a weight of judgment Victoria was not accustomed to. It was not admiration, the kind she was used to receiving in the business world. It was not fear, The kind her employees usually held toward her. It was something sharper, more raw. An unspoken verdict. She felt strangely small. And that infuriated her. Hey, princess. How much longer are you going to stare at those dishes? A voice snapped her out of her thoughts. She turned her eyes, meeting those of a middle-aged man, with salt and pepper hair, and a left arm amputated just below the elbow. Joe Parker? At least that's how he had introduced himself earlier. A former Marine who had lost part of his arm in an explosion in Afghanistan. There was always a slight smile on his face, but his eyes were sharper than any seasoned negotiator Victoria had ever faced in a boardroom. You're a billionaire, are not you? I saw you on the news. Victoria lifted her chin, trying to hold on to some semblance of her usual poise. If you know who I am, then you must understand that I do not belong here. Joe chuckled, a dry, knowing laugh laced with irony. Oh, trust me. Everyone here knows you do not belong. But you know what's interesting? No one cares. Victoria narrowed her eyes, that challenge rubbing her the wrong way. Joe stepped closer, his voice dropping, carrying a weight that was impossible to ignore. We do not need pity, we just want respect. Before Victoria could respond, another voice cut in. Respect? You expect that from someone like her, Joe? Victoria turned her gaze, locking onto a woman with a strong, solid frame, and dark brown eyes as deep as a midnight lake. Maria Torres, a former soldier who had served in Iraq. Her face bore a long scar that ran from her cheek down to her neck, a testament to the battles she had survived. Victoria was not unsettled by the scar. It was the look in Maria's eyes. Cold, unyielding, fearless. Maria stepped closer, facing Victoria head-on, not blinking. Once you think money can fix everything, no one here cares who you are. Her voice was not loud, but it carried more weight than any insult Victoria had ever endured. And for the first time, Victoria did not know how to respond. She could stare down the shrewdest CEOs. She could negotiate billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. But these people in front of her, they were not like anyone she had ever encountered. They were not afraid of her. They did not need anything from her. They did not care who she was, and that made her feel exposed. Like she was standing bare in a world where she held no power. A world where money meant nothing. Joe was still watching her, as if waiting to see what she would do next. Maria remained standing with her arms crossed, eyes filled with scrutiny. Victoria took a slow breath, suppressing the urge to scream in frustration. I do not need to be their friend. I just need to survive these damn 200 hours. Without another word, she turned back to the sink, picked up another plate and resumed scrubbing. She did not say anything else. But for the first time in her life, she felt smaller than the people she had once considered beneath her. Victoria Lancaster had never felt like she was part of this world. From the very first day she set foot in the Los Angeles Veteran Support Center, she kept her distance. She did her work, no small talk, no interactions, treating these community service hours like an unavoidable business transaction. But in that silence, something was slowly changing. At first, Victoria only observed, not because she cared, but because she had no other choice. She saw men with tired eyes, yet still joking with one another. Their battlefield stories, their lost comrades, these were not tales of bravado, but memories carved into their souls. She saw women like Maria Torres, who had lost a part of their lives, yet kept moving forward without complaints, without bitterness. She had never met people like this before. They had no power, no wealth, yet they carried a strength Victoria had never understood. One morning, as Victoria finished her shift in the kitchen, she stepped into the hallway and saw Maria struggling with a large shipment box. It was bulky, heavy, and Maria was alone. Victoria could have walked past. She could have pretended not to see, just as she always did, with things that did not concern her. But this time she stopped without a word. She stepped forward, bent down, grabbed one side of the box and lifted it. Maria turned, her eyes filled with surprise. They looked at each other for a moment, before Maria gave a small nod and quietly said, "Thank you." A simple word. But something in Maria's voice made Victoria feel unfamiliar. It was not pleading. It was not submissive, and it was not reluctant. It was acknowledgement. For the first time, Victoria did not feel judged. For the first time, she was not doing something for recognition or gain. And for the first time, she felt a different kind of joy. The joy of helping someone else. From that day on, Victoria did not change completely. She still found the work frustrating, still got annoyed whenever she felt challenged, but she started listening more. She started noticing things she had never paid attention to before. She saw Joe Parker, who had only one arm, yet was the hardest worker in the center. She saw a young veteran once crippled by PTSD, sitting in the corner, reading every morning as a way to find himself again. She saw Maria Torres, despite her severe past injuries, never turning down an opportunity to help. She no longer saw them as weak people to be pitied. She began to understand that they were far stronger than she had ever imagined. And though she did not say it out loud, though she was not ready to admit it, she was changing. Victoria Lancaster never cried since she was a child. She had learned not to show emotions, never to reveal weakness. When her parents divorced and left her alone in an empty house, she did not cry. When she was crushed in her first business deal and lost millions of dollars, she did not cry. When the financial world labeled her as the steel rose, cold, sharp, and heartless, she still did not cry. But that night, among the people she once considered beneath her, she could not stop the tears from falling. Victoria met James Carter late one evening while she was cleaning up the dining area. At the center, James was unlike the other veterans. He did not talk much, did not crack jokes like Joe, did not have Maria's sharp wit. He just sat in a corner, holding a cup of cold tea, staring through the dimly lit window with a distant gaze. Victoria had planned to walk past. She was not in the habit of striking up conversations with strangers, especially those who did not seem to want to talk. But just as she turned away, James spoke, his voice deep and steady, carrying the weight of experience. "Do you know the true cost of freedom?" The question made Victoria freeze. She turned back, meeting James's eyes. Eyes that held no judgment, no anger, only the heavy burden of memories. James pulled out a chair and gestured for her to sit. She hesitated, but then quietly took a seat across from him. James took a deep breath, as if piecing together fragments of the past, then spoke slowly. "I served in the military for 15 years. In those 15 years, I saw things no one should ever have to see." Victoria remained silent for the first time, genuinely wanting to listen. James continued, "I watched my comrades get shot, right in front of me, but I could not stop to save them, because if I did, I would die too. I saw children in war zones, forced to hold guns, before they were even old enough to understand that killing is not a game, I lost my best friends not on the battlefield, but when they came home, carrying wounds no one could see. Victoria clenched her hands, her breathing growing heavier. James took a sip of his cold tea before continuing, his voice lowering, as if every word carried years of pain. You see, Victoria, people like you, people who have everything, money, power, status, you'll never understand the real price of freedom. The freedom you enjoy every day was paid for with the lives of people like us. And the hardest part, when we come back, we become shadows. People like you do not see us. No one sees us. Victoria felt a sharp pain in her chest. She could not respond, because for the first time in her life, she realized she had nothing to say. A gentle breeze drifted through the window, carrying the cold of the night. Victoria lowered her head, hiding her tear-filled eyes. But James saw he did not smile, did not mock her, did not comfort her. He simply nodded slightly as if he knew. Finally she understood she had once believed. She was the strongest person in the room, that the people around her were the ones who needed help. But no, they were 100 times stronger than she was. They had fought for something she had never understood. Something that could not be bought with money. Something that could not be negotiated with power. And now Victoria Lancaster, the billionaire who had once thought herself above all, felt small for the first time in her life. She cried not because she lost, not because she had been broken, but because she realized that for her entire life, she had never truly understood the world. Victoria Lancaster stepped into the courtroom, but this time there were no sharp clicks of high heels, no expensive designer suits, and no arrogant smirk. She was no longer the woman she had been. On the first day, the courtroom remained the same. Still the rigid wooden benches, the same dim yellow lighting from the ceiling, the same Judge Jonathan Mitchell, sitting in his authoritative position. But Victoria was different. She was no longer the billionaire who thought the law could be bent to her will. She was no longer the woman who looked down on others. She no longer saw this place as a battlefield. To prove her power today, she came to accept everything. Judge Mitchell set the case file down, his sharp gaze sweeping over Victoria. But this time there was no judgment like before. Defendant Lancaster, you have completed 200 hours of community service. Today the court will determine whether this sentence has truly served its purpose. Do you have anything to say? Victoria looked up, her eyes no longer held arrogance, but something deeper, an awakening. She turned toward Mr. Walter Jenkins, the man whose life she had nearly taken away through her own carelessness. Today he was still there, still the man with silver hair, but his eyes no longer carried the same heavy disappointment. Victoria swallowed, then slowly spoke one word at a time. Mr. Jenkins, I'm sorry. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. The reporters in the back row put down their pens. The observers held their breath for a moment. Everyone waited to see if this was just another lie. But Victoria's voice did not waver, and her gaze did not dodge. I was wrong not just for reckless driving. I was wrong for disregarding someone else's life. I was wrong for thinking I was above the law. And most of all, I was wrong for not realizing it sooner. The first genuine apology of Victoria Lancaster's life. Judge Mitchell gave a small nod, seemingly satisfied with Victoria's response. But what surprised him was what she said next. Victoria took a deep breath and continued, this time with an unusual certainty. I want to continue helping the center. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Reporters quickly flipped open their notebooks. Spectators leaned in to whisper to one another, and even Mr. Jenkins raised an eyebrow in surprise. Judge Mitchell narrowed his eyes at Victoria, as if making sure he had heard correctly. What did you say, Defendant Lancaster? Victoria lifted her head, her voice carrying no hesitation. I want to continue helping the center. Not out of obligation, but because I truly want to. A heavy silence fell over the room. No one could believe that Victoria Lancaster, the woman who once scorned manual labor, who once called veterans failures, now wanted to return to that place voluntarily. But she did not back down from their skepticism. She knew exactly what she was doing. Judge Mitchell studied Victoria for a long moment, as if trying to read every thought in her mind. Then slowly he nodded, his hand resting on the wooden gavel before him. Defendant Lancaster, the court recognizes that you have fulfilled your sentence with full responsibility, and if you truly wish to continue helping the center, that is your choice. No one can force you to do it anymore. The gavel struck. The trial was officially over. But for Victoria Lancaster, this was not an ending. This was merely the beginning of a new chapter. As she stepped out of the courthouse, the sunlight felt different today. She no longer felt like she was leaving a battle. She was stepping onto a new path. She no longer resented the place she had once been forced to go. She no longer thought of the 200 hours of community service as a punishment, but as a lesson. She needed to continue. Descending the steps, she saw Maria Torres and Joe Parker standing nearby, arms crossed, watching her with an unreadable expression. Maria raised an eyebrow, her voice low and teasing. So you're coming back, Huck? No one's forcing you this time. Victoria smiled, but it was no longer the arrogant smirk of her past. I know, and I still want to come back. For the first time, Victoria was not walking into a place because she had to. For the first time, she was choosing to walk in because she wanted to, and that was the real change. Victoria Lancaster was no longer the woman she used to be. She no longer walked into the Los Angeles Veteran Support Center in expensive high heels with a look of disdain. She no longer saw the people there as strangers, as those beneath her. She was no longer the arrogant billionaire. But more importantly, she no longer wanted to be that person. Victoria did not return to the center just to fulfill an obligation. She came back because she wanted to. Gone were the luxurious suits. Now she wore a simple t-shirt, jeans and sneakers. Not because anyone told her to, but because she'd come to understand that appearances no longer mattered. Her time at the center was no longer a forced responsibility, but had become something truly meaningful to her. But she knew that just helping on her own was not enough. She wanted to do more. And so the Lancaster Foundation for Veterans was born. Victoria was not the type of philanthropist who donated money just for publicity. When she decided to establish a foundation to support veterans, she was not content with simply writing checks and walking away. She took the time to understand the real challenges these people faced. They did not need pity. They did not need free meals just to survive. They needed an opportunity to stand on their own 2 feet. The Lancaster Foundation did not just provide financial support. It also funded vocational training programs for veterans, connected companies with veterans seeking to rebuild their lives, covered medical and psychological treatment costs for those suffering from post-war trauma, helped veterans reintegrate into society, find jobs and start new lives. And for the first time in her life, Victoria did not need anyone's praise or recognition. She just wanted to do the right thing. Those who once despised and resented her now looked at her differently. Joe Parker, a man who had lost an arm and mocked her on her first day at the center, now stood beside her at meetings, introducing veterans to new opportunities, funded by her foundation. One day, as she sat on the center steps after a long day of work, Joe approached, hands on his hips, looking at her with an amused expression. Who would have thought? The arrogant billionaire is here with us now. Victoria laughed, but it was no longer the mocking laugh of her past self. I cannot believe it either. Joe nodded slowly, then held out his hand. So can I call you a friend now? Victoria looked at his hand, the hand of someone she once never imagined having any connection with. She shook his hand firmly, with no reluctance or hesitation. I'd be honored. Maria Torres, the woman with a long scar on her face and eyes as sharp as knives, was not as quick to trust Victoria as Joe was. She kept her distance, watching Victoria closely, waiting to see if this was just another act. But over time, Victoria proved she was no longer the same person. One evening, while the center was preparing for a veteran appreciation event, Victoria unexpectedly appeared in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, helping Maria arrange the food. Maria looked up, raising an eyebrow in curiosity. What are you doing? Victoria smiled softly, continuing her work without looking up. Have you ever seen me in a kitchen before? I think I'm getting the hang of it. Maria narrowed her eyes at her, then chuckled a short but genuine laugh. For the first time, Maria no longer saw Victoria as a stranger. I think you still need practice, but at least you're not dropping the pans anymore. They burst into laughter like true teammates. James Carter, the man who once made Victoria cry with his story about the cost of freedom, remained a man of few words. But one day, when Victoria visited him, bringing him a hot cup of tea, he gave her a small nod, a sign she knew meant he acknowledged her transformation. No words were needed. That single nod told her she had done something truly meaningful. Victoria Lancaster was no longer just a billionaire, obsessed with power and personal gain. She no longer believed that justice could be bought. She no longer saw these people as weak or beneath her. She had found something she had never truly understood before: the real meaning of life. And this time, no one was forcing her to do anything. She chose this path herself, and it was the best decision she had ever made. Victoria Lancaster stood in front of the Los Angeles Veteran Support Center, a place she once saw as foreign as a sentence, as a punishment. But today it had become a part of her life. She took a deep breath, feeling the light morning chill blend with the laughter and conversations of the people inside. Then she smiled, a smile no longer filled with arrogance, no longer guarded. I used to think money was power. Now I understand. Real power is the ability to change someone's life. Joe Parker, her unexpected friend, chuckled softly, crossing his arms. So you finally learned something? Maria Torres, as always, frowned at her, but there was a warmth in her eyes. Are you sure this is still Victoria Lancaster? I think someone must have swapped you out. Victoria shrugged, offering a small smile. Maybe I just finally found myself. The 200 hours of community service should have been nothing more than a sentence. But for Victoria, it had become a door. One that opened into a world she had never known. She had not just paid the price for her mistakes. She had learned a lesson that no billion-dollar deal could ever teach her. She was no longer the woman who believed money could buy everything. Now she was a woman who understood that the true meaning of power lies in how we use it to help others. Joe Maria and the other veterans watched her, as if still waiting to see what she would do next. Victoria knew they once doubted her, once despised her, but now they were not waiting for her to return. Out of obligation, they knew she truly wanted to be here. She looked around, took a deep breath, then stepped onto the center's front steps. Maria stared at her, curiosity in her voice. "So, what are you going to do now?" Victoria met their gazes, her smile small but resolute. "I'm not leaving, I'm not done here." No more words were needed. They understood she had chosen this path, not because she was forced to, but because she wanted to. And for the first time in her life, Victoria Lancaster was not just a billionaire. She was a real person. An old chapter closed. A new journey began. Victoria Lancaster started this story with arrogance, believing that power and wealth placed her above everything. But in the end, it was the very people she once looked down on who taught her the most valuable lesson about the true meaning of life. Her transformation did not come from coercion. It came from realization, a realization that power is not in the numbers in a bank account, but in how we use it to uplift others. And what about you? If you had the chance to change a life with action, with understanding, would you take it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story inspired you, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue bringing you more meaningful stories. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.